Well, I'd like to add to Brianna's welcome to Regent College, my welcome to this third installment in Interface, our autumn lecture series in theology and science. The purpose of these lectures is to explore the many and often surprising ways that theology and science can enrich one another. To do that, we therefore seek to challenge the myth, the largely 19th century myth, that there must be a conflict, perhaps a kind of Cold War, between these fields of study. Now, one of the best ways to counter mythology is through better historical understanding. After all, theology and science have not always existed in the way we think of them today. As we will hear in tonight's lecture, the empirical study of nature often went by the name natural philosophy, as recently as the 17th century. It was a discipline that saw itself as vitally connected to the study of God. What's more, people of faith have shown a variety of postures towards advance in scientific understanding, often exhibiting curiosity, humility, and even wonder rather than defensiveness. As such, they remain an inspiration for what we do here. Now, our Interface series is made possible by a generous grant from the John Templeton Foundation, and we are grateful to the Foundation for providing the means to bring you tonight's distinguished speaker. Bruce Hindmarsh is the James M. Houston Professor of Spiritual Theology here at Regent. He is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, as well as a past president of the American Society of Church History. Professor Hindmarsh holds a DPhil in theology from the University of Oxford and is the author of 3 books, including most recently, The Spirit of Early Evangelicalism, True Religion in a Modern World. I would especially recommend this book for those who, like me, are looking for clarity and hope about what evangelicalism means today. As James Houston has said, contemporary confusion is often the result of ahistoricism, which is to say, we often don't understand our present because we haven't properly taken our bearings from the past. It's therefore fitting that, as the holder of the Houston Chair, Bruce Hindmarsh counters this trend by telling our history with scholarly rigor and stylistic grace. Tonight we're delighted then to have him deliver a lecture entitled Re-enchanting the Universe, Evangelicals and the Rise of Science. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, David, for that thoughtful introduction, and thank you for coming out on this Tuesday evening. If you have been taking in this whole series this autumn at Regent College on the interface of faith and science, you may recall that Alistair McGrath began by challenging the idea that religion and science are necessarily in conflict. He argued instead that the discourses of religion and science may be seen as layered and complementary. Religion addresses questions that really can't be adequately addressed within a naturalistic scientific framework, questions that science takes as its purview. In particular, questions of moral judgment, what ought we to do? Questions of meaning and purpose, why are we here? Invite a religious perspective. Sarah Coakley then spoke on the possibility of a kind of natural theology, thinking about God from what nature tells us. A kind of natural theology that reflects on the layered phenomenon of cooperation as observed in the mathematical modeling of evolution, a process to be reckoned with in addition to the standard account of mutation and selection. She further invited us to consider the possibility that the ancient teaching about the cultivated practice of spiritual senses might be drawn upon to speak today in realist terms of the presence of God in the world, and to offer challenges, metaphysical challenges, to the naturalism that can creep into the discussion of science. In my lecture this evening, I would like to offer an exploration in the history of science and faith that illustrates both McGrath's model of complementarity as well as the significance of Coakley's attention to the spiritual senses. I'll offer a series of historical footnotes on these things. I'll be focusing on the 18th century as the moment when the theories of Isaac Newton were being debated vigorously in society and received into mainstream culture in the English-speaking world. The reception of Newtonianism in the middle third of the century coincided with the rise of a significant, broad-based devotional movement among Protestants that historians refer to as a transatlantic evangelical awakening. It was the very same generation that witnessed this transatlantic revival that also came to accept the postulates of Newtonian science. We may be accustomed today, for various reasons, to think of popular evangelicalism as inimical to science. But with only a few exceptions, it was not so in the beginning. My argument tonight is that English-speaking evangelicals in the 18th century largely embraced the new science, but they nested the insights of materialist science within a larger vision of the universe, in which God was a creating, animating, guiding, and redeeming presence. This, I think, illustrates something of McGrath's thesis. The keynote of their response to the natural world as revealed by science was wonder, love, and praise. Their devotion acted to re-enchant the universe that the new science had seemingly drained of transcendence. And they often did so precisely in the language of the spiritual senses. This illustrates something, I think, of Coakley's thesis or her concerns. I'll proceed this evening by discussing first Newtonianism and its cultural reception, and then secondly by examining various case studies in which we can observe evangelicals interacting with modern scientific methods, findings, and practices. Pardon me while we deal with the technology. All right. Still not up? Okay, I have it here. Okay. Okay, we're back in business. There we go. Okay. At the beginning of the 18th century, when Isaac Newton's Principia, published in 1687, was only making its way into mainstream culture. It was published in Latin, and so it took a while for it to make its way into mainstream culture. Natural philosophy was still properly a branch of philosophy. This, as David was saying, was the word that was used for science, natural philosophy, and it was a branch of philosophy closely related to metaphysics, logic, and moral philosophy. It was a part of a comprehensive vision of the unity of all knowledge. In the general scholium of the second edition of the Principia in 1729, I think that's when it appeared in English, Newton himself engaged in theological reflection, and he added this. He said, "And thus much concerning God, to discourse of whom from the appearance of things, from nature, certainly does belong to natural philosophy." To discuss God and his attributes. Theology was understood as a natural conversation partner with physics in the philosophical enterprise. Over the course of the century, however, philosophy came to stand apart, natural philosophy came to stand apart from other fields with its distinctive emphasis on observation, experiment, and mathematics. Those three things, observation, experiment, and mathematics, these were key to Newtonianism. So this diagram is from a schematic of a popular book, Astronomy Explained, on Sir Isaac Newton's Principles and Made Easy to Those Who Have Not Studied Mathematics. Isn't that a great title? Isaac Newton for Dummies. Newtonianism then is, just a couple other comments about that. The empirical methodology of the Opticks, so his book on the Opticks, the Principia included his laws of motion, it included his inverse law of gravitation, it included a lot of math, it included united celestial and terrestrial mechanics. It doesn't work differently up there than it does down here. There's a lot, this is one of the most important science texts that was ever written. But the Opticks was much more experimental. And the empirical methodology of the Opticks was what counted for most in terms of the takeoff of Newtonianism in the 18th century. Over time, physics became less a synonym for natural philosophy than a field concerned with the study of inanimate nature by experimental procedure and observation, as it is today. Newtonianism, then, is a term which, in its narrowest sense, refers to scientific theories and scientific endeavors that drew upon the precedent set in the Principia and the Opticks. But in its broadest sense, has been extended to just about any idea or any activity or any group that identified itself with the growing prestige of Isaac Newton, and his prestige just grew and grew in the 18th century. And there were many that identified with Newton. Newtonianism was a house with many mansions, modeling nature with mathematical laws, adopting an empirical approach to nature, having recourse to experimental demonstration. All of these were Newtonian. But within this, there was room for a range of contestable theories, contestable scientific ideas within this legacy, tremendous pluralism in the social contexts where Newtonianism was received and where his ideas were legitimated. One of the most important grounds of debate related to the religious implications of all this science. The Boyle Lectures were established in 1691, quote, for proving the Christian religion against notorious infidels. And these became a key forum for the development of natural theology that drew on Isaac Newton's philosophy to make a posteriori theological arguments, that is, arguments from the evidence, from the design of the universe. This is a book by William Whiston, one of these physical theologians, trying to unite Newtonianism and his reading of the Bible. The mode of the new natural theology would be typically called physico-theology, uniting physics and theology. But ideas about what constituted natural theology or natural religion, just reading it off of nature, were diverse and could be enlisted in support of Christianity or against it. Several of the early theological supporters of Newtonianism favored an unorthodox Christology. Many of them were Arian, such as William Whiston. And when others, such as Matthew Toland, used the idea of natural religion, the religion of nature, to dispense with Christianity altogether, religious anxieties rose accordingly. And the Newtonian system did leave a number of important questions open for discussion. It opened new questions that would have serious metaphysical and religious implications. The status of matter as inert particles, vis inertia, nothing moves until it's moved. Matter is inert, no form principle, no inner animation. The determinism of mechanics, everything caught in a system of cause and effect. The origin of motion, if everything is inertial until it receives motion, where does motion originate? The non-mechanical nature of gravity. This freaked everybody out. Non-contact action, it sounds like magic. How does that work? What is gravity? What is action at a distance? The ontological status of void space, that space is empty. All of these things invited reflection, religious reflection, philosophical reflection on the meaning of these things. How did the knowledge of this new science make its way into the general culture? As historians have pointed out, it wasn't a fried egg model of diffusion, with the new knowledge of the scientist at the center, like an egg yolk, and then an ever-thinning egg white that symbolizes the dissemination of the knowledge into the culture. There's the scientist, and then the knowledge just flows out into the culture. It's a lot messier than this. There's negotiation, there's contestation, bits are picked up, things that are practical are seized on. Newton's ideas were vigorously debated and explored in a number of social contexts. In these Boyle Lectures, in a number of political contexts, it was seen to be the model of the English government as opposed to French absolutism. And it was picked up in popular science demonstrations, in polite books for ladies, in storybooks for children, even in new explanations for folk remedies. In the practical application of scientific ideas in agriculture, in medicine, in botany, natural knowledge didn't just flow smoothly from theory to practice, but in every case there's social negotiation, practical considerations, local appropriations. And when you realize that this is what's going on, it becomes clear that the early evangelical communities that emerged in the middle third of the 18th century were one of these important local contexts for negotiating the meaning and the application of natural knowledge in the 18th century. I mean, we could do a whole lecture just John Wesley on medicine, John Wesley's fascination with electricity, and he's mediating this to very ordinary people. He attended the early electrical demonstrations. He wrote a whole book on electricity. He wondered if this could be a universal cure. He had a little electrical machine. He liked to electrify everything, see if it would speed healing. Even baldness could be cured, he thought, with electricity. Everybody was fascinated with it. Well, so this is a context for absorbing the new science. Although evangelicals engaged in some detail with the findings of the new science, there were some that were involved in the production of scientific knowledge. Their approach was largely not that of these earlier Boyle lecturers and the early apologists who worked to construct a physical theology that would stand up to the challenge of deism and natural religion. In one sense, that kind of work had been done. The Orthodox apologists had kind of done their work. Instead, again, what was the evangelical concern in these communities? It was to nest the insights that are being received from science in a larger vision of the universe in which God is still emphatically present. They would accept, if you like, methodological naturalism, but not metaphysical naturalism. God was still present. In this sense, their devotion, even their ordinary popular devotion, did a kind of metaphysical work above its pay grade. Some of you may know Charles Wesley's famous hymn, Love Divine, All Loves Excelling, still sometimes sung at weddings by the well-meaning sister of the bride. It is a celebration of love come down. God's love come down to us in the coming of Jesus Christ into the world. But the hymn ends in this great parabolic motion. Christ descends, and then we ascend. We cast our crowns before thee. Changed from glory into glory, we cast our crowns before thee, lost in wonder, love, and praise. This moment of ecstasy, of apophasis, being speechless in wonder, love, and praise. Lay Methodists all over England and Scotland and elsewhere would have been singing this hymn at the time that Charles' brother John Wesley, published his multi-volume compendium, a survey of the wisdom of God in creation. Here John presented the latest findings of 18th century science in the post-Newtonian world. It was a multi-volume compendium, 4 editions. He kept adding to it until it reached 5 volumes. A survey of the wisdom of God in creation, of all the scientific findings he could read about. He revised the work, he added to the work, as I say, until it reached 5 volumes. The conclusion of his preface in all the volumes, in all the editions, though, takes us full circle back to Charles's hymn. Really interesting. What did he hope this account would do for people? Just educating them about science. He said he hoped that this would display the amazing power, wisdom, and goodness of the great Creator, and that it would serve to warm our hearts and to fill our mouths with what? With wonder, love, and praise. It's the very same language as Charles Wesley's hymns. The work of God in creation, the work of God in redemption, invited and stirred the same religious emotions, the same responsive doxology. It even called forth exactly the same praise. Evangelical devotion then proved enormously significant for cultivating a worshipful response to the natural world and a readiness to perceive God's continuous presence in the world revealed by science. It's this kind of cultivation of certain kinds of sensibility that I think Sarah Coakley was talking about. This devout reception of science reached ordinary people. Wesley was confident that tradesmen and tradeswomen would easily understand at least 9/10 of the content of his book. It was among these sorts that he sent his co-workers hustling for subscriptions. He suggested his followers might save up 6 pence or a shilling a week. 2 or 3 people could go together and pre-purchase a set. How, though, did one perceive God's presence in this natural world that was described this way by Wesley and others? Wesley used the language of the spiritual senses. The invisible world was, he said, above, beneath, on every side. Only the natural man discerneth it not, partly because, he said, he hath no spiritual senses. However, the human person, redeemed and renewed by God's Spirit, could, he felt, be keenly conscious of God's presence everywhere in the material world. They see him in the height above and in the depth beneath. They see him filling all in all. The pure in heart see all things full of God. They see him in the firmament of heaven, in the moon, walking in brightness, in the sun when he rejoiceth as a giant to run his course. They see God in the wind and in the rain and in the fields. This is to directly counter metaphysical naturalism. We are to see the Creator, he said, in the glass, that is, in the mirror of every creature. Look upon nothing as separate from God, he said, which is indeed a kind of practical atheism. I didn't know that term existed in the 18th century, a kind of practical atheism. He even drew upon the language of an earlier age, saying that God upholds all things as the anima mundi, the soul of the universe. He pervades and actuates the whole created frame and is, in a true sense, he said, the soul of the universe. Well, we find a similar attitude on the other side of the Atlantic in the evangelical awakening with the young Jonathan Edwards, who came across the new science during his years as a student at Yale College in New Haven. Isaac Newton himself had contributed a copy of his Principia and Opticks to the collection of volumes given to establish the library at the infant college. The collection is unfortunately called the Dummer Collection, that was the donor. But this collection given to establish the infant college. These books were taken out of their crates in 1718 in the middle of Edward's undergraduate education. And it produced an awakening for him. The new physics literally arrived on his doorstep as a student. He was soon keeping his own science notebooks, including a notebook called, my daughter loves this title. She said she's got to keep a notebook like this now, Things to be Considered and Fully Written About, which was one of his main science notebooks. Evidently, there were a lot of things to be considered and fully written about. Why thunder a great way off sounds grum, but nearer sounds very sharp? How arterial blood descends and venal blood ascends according to the laws of hydrostatics? Why the fixed stars twinkle but not the planets? Why we need not think that the soul is in the fingers just because we have feeling in our fingers? Why the sea is salty? And the list goes on and on and on. There seemed no end to Edwards' intellectual curiosity about the natural world. And he also explored a number of specifically Newtonian subjects, refraction of light and the inverse law of gravitation and a number of these subjects. And solidity. He was very interested in the concept of solidity, what makes something solid, which was in query 32 of Newton's Opticks. At the same time as he was experiencing a genuine scientific awakening, there was a parallel spiritual awakening going on for Edwards as a student at Yale. He wrote of the new sense, quite different from anything I ever experienced before. Here's the language of the senses. Nature was transfigured. Every tree seemed for him to be a burning bush, every cloud a pillar of fire. The appearance of everything was altered, he said. There seemed to be, as it were, a calm, sweet cast or appearance of divine glory in almost everything. The divine glory, notice, was not just deducible from nature. It was perceived in nature. It wasn't just the QED of a physico-theological argument. It was a new kind of perception. All the objects of inquiry in his natural philosophy notebooks now seemed to shine with a borrowed light from beyond the walls of the world. God's excellency, he said, his wisdom, his purity and love seemed to appear in everything, in the sun, moon and stars, in the clouds and blue sky, in the grass, the flowers and trees, in the water, and in all nature. He grasped all of these things with a kind of direct devotional intelligence that concentrated his powers. These natural phenomena viewed this way, he said, used to greatly fix my mind. I used to often sit and view the moon for a long time, and so in the daytime spent much time viewing the clouds and the sky to behold the sweet glory of God in these things. There's a new sensibility, a new layer, if you like. He offers another example of the spiritual senses in the age of materialist science. We don't have time to talk about it this evening, but in time, Edwards works all this out in an impressive, magisterial, comprehensive intellectual program, uniting science, ontology, ethics, psychology, history, and theology. And he genuinely tries to respond at a very deep level to nest Newtonian science within a world in which God is intimately present, and he works this out intellectually. But where else might we witness this sensibility? I thought I'd take us somewhere different this evening, to the arts. T.S. Eliot admired the way earlier 17th century poets could bring the metaphysical poets, John Donne and George Herbert and these sorts of people, could bring diverse materials together into harmony. Poets for whom thought and feeling were combined in a unified sensibility in their response to the world. This is before kind of fact-value distinctions and all that kind of language. However, T.S. Eliot famously described a kind of dissociated sensibility. That's his word. Dissociated sensibility that set in the 18th century with the advent of mechanical philosophy and materialist science. The new science made it more difficult to hold together the spiritual with the material. After all, what is the response of a unified sensibility, thought, feeling, religious devotion, to particulate matter in void space obeying abstract mathematical laws? How do you respond to that? Well, his focus on the arts gives us a clue where to look in this period where Newtonianism is being received and evangelicals are responding. Here's where we might return now to examine some of the lesser-known evangelical poets and literary figures from this period to see how they responded to the world revealed by science. In their writings, we see science embraced not principally with apologetic intentions, not defensively or aiming to construct a rational physical theology, but with devotional aspirations, searching out more profound occasions for praise. And we'll look at this in the work of the Anglican writer James Harvey, the Baptist poet Anne Steele, and the African-American Congregationalist poet Phyllis Wheatley. Those are our three remaining case studies. James Harvey had been part of John Wesley's Holy Club at Oxford. Later, as a hard-working parish priest, often in poor health, he still found time to write and published a series of what can only be called prose poems on nature. He wrote in a rhapsodic style that was suited to the taste of his contemporaries. It's actually very difficult to read today. The first time I picked it up, I found it almost unreadable. Many of us would find it too flowery, but it was exactly the taste of his period. His mid-century collection, Meditations and Contemplations, a kind of compendium of his writings of this sort, was immensely popular. I want to emphasize this for a moment. By the in 1748, when he published it, it immediately went into 4 editions. There were over 100 editions by the end of the century, including imprints in London, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dublin, Belfast, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. It's translated into French. Sales are huge. Editions typically running in the range of 5,000 to 6,000 in each edition. I have a friend who just published her magnum opus with Oxford, and the print run was 200 books. Hopefully they'll go into reprinting soon. But Harvey was widely reprinted and widely read, very popular. William Blake was a great admirer. He would inspire later Gothic literature and so on. It's worth recalling all of this popularity the influence of Harvey, since he remains less well known today, and because of the way his style went out of fashion after the first wave of 19th century Romanticism. He was self-consciously imitating the sort of style one finds in the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury's philosophical rhapsodies. And in part, this was an evangelical tactic. It was, he said, quote, to bait the gospel hook agreeably to the prevailing taste. But his response to the natural world was no less genuine for this, and he clearly found an eager and receptive audience. Meditations and Contemplations, this book, is probably the most representative example of evangelical devotion as it engaged with Newtonian ideas. In Wesley's survey that I mentioned earlier, he repeatedly turns to Harvey for exemplary sentiments of praise in response to the terraqueous globe, the meteors, the heavenly bodies, and other phenomena. When Jonathan Edwards, that we just talked about, was introduced to the book by a Scottish correspondent as, quote, the most polite of any that has been written in an evangelical strain in this century, he quickly got himself a copy, quoted it, loaned it out to others, and mined it for other sources to read. Harvey circulates. Very early, he set out his program. We should always view the visible system, he said, with an evangelical telescope and with an evangelical microscope, regarding Christ Jesus as the great projector and architect that planned and executed the amazing scheme. This is the Christian's natural philosophy. The word evangelical has all sorts of associations, but here he's really talking about the gospel. He's using the word evangelical like we talk about the 4 Gospels. It's we don't leave Jesus Christ out of the equation, he's saying. And this is his sort of phrase for that. His motivation is equally clear. Did we carefully attend to this leading principle, he said, in all our examinations of nature, it would doubtless be the most powerful means of enkindling our love and strengthening our faith. There's the cultivation of these virtues. When one looks around and sees all the millions of substances, that's an important term, he said one should carry a single transporting reflection, namely, the maker of them all died on the cross for me. How can I remain any longer indifferent? Anyways, Harvey developed a set of theologically robust principles for contemplating what he called the teeming earth and the smiling skies, and all were Christ-centered, all were Christological. First, he articulates the patristic creatio ex nihilo doctrine that God creates out of nothing. Christ made them when they were not. He fetched them up from utter darkness and gave them both their being and their beauty. Secondly, he affirms the cosmic scope of Christ's redemption. Christ recovered them. This is like the language of Romans 8, that all of creation is caught up in the work of redemption. Christ recovered them when they were forfeited. The cosmic scope of Christ's redemption. Thirdly, he points to the contingency of the created order. Christ upholds them, which would otherwise tumble into ruin. Or more poetically, his finger rolls the seasons round and presides over all the celestial revolutions. And finally, he extends this contingency, we'll talk about that word more later, to life itself, fusing the ancient language of vitalism or emanation with the Newtonian idea of inert matter. Christ actuates them, which would otherwise be lifeless and insignificant. He only has life, and whatever operates by an emanation from his all-sufficiency. As he continues, his metaphor for this contingency, the contingency means it might not have been. That's what contingency means. It might not have been. It could have been otherwise. It's not necessary that the act of creation was that God wanted beings to be blessed with his blessedness. It might not have been. His metaphor for this contingency is economic, but he merges this with the Pauline notion of pleroma, or fullness in Christ. Pensioners they are, this whole world that we observe, this whole universe, pensioners, constant pensioners on his bounty, and they borrow their all from his fullness. It's almost a doctrine of analogia entis. Harvey would often turn thus to texts from St. Paul's letter to the Colossians for this cosmic Christological doctrine. He defended what he was doing as more than lawless flights of fancy. And there are lots of people who engage nature that way, just merely emblematically, with arbitrary, pretty illustrations of doctrinal truths. And he was saying this is more than fancy, precisely because his observations were grounded in what he called this grand doctrine, the hinge upon which they all turn. And then he quotes the Christ hymn in Colossians, that all things were created by him and for him, and that in him all things consist. So all told, his contemplation of nature was deeply considered theologically. In Harvey's final contemplation of the starry heavens, and in a sense he sort of begins with the tombs and the earth, and he works his way up into the heavens. In his contemplation of the starry heavens, it's clear how wholeheartedly he embraced Newtonianism and observational astronomy, full stop. In fact, he added a prefatory note to the reader who might have doubts about astronomy. He said, "It may seem unaccountable to an unlearned reader that astronomers should speak such amazing things and speak them with such an air of assurance concerning the distances and the magnitude and the motions and the relations of the heavenly bodies." Harvey reassures this uneducated reader. He said, "Consider the cases of eclipses and with what exactness they are calculated. They are not only foretold, but the very instant of their beginning is determined. This can be done," he said, "down to the nicety of a moment and calculated hundreds of years into the future. All of this is," he says, "a matter of fact, absolutely indisputable. The principles of science on which these calculations are based," he said, "are not mere conjecture or precarious supposition. They have a real, certain foundation in the nature and constitution of things." Very robust statement. Still, after all this has been said in his preface, he said, "What are these things, though, above all? They are objects of admiration rather than science." Science is going to be taken up into his religious devotion. These sentiments were illustrated for the reader in a frontispiece that Harvey added to the second volume of his third edition. He added a 2-page explanation. In the picture, there is observational astronomy at work on the left with a telescope pointed toward the stars. Can you see that? There is also a natural philosopher on the right instructing students, quote, according to the Newtonian hypothesis. There's a book sticking out from under the schematic of the planetary orbits there on the right that prominently displays Isaac Newton's name. Right next to Newton's name, we can read the Latin words, "In arent gloriam Dei" on the map, words from the opening of Psalm 19, explaining that the heavens do what? They declare the glory of God. Another student, head bowed in an attitude of humility, is unfurling on the far left, unfurling a diagram, illustrating the centrifugal and centripetal forces that combine in perfect balance to keep the planets in their orbits. Here the Latin motto is "Sic gratia Dei," or "Such is the operation of divine grace." Amidst all this scientific activity, the key figure in the picture is the one most brightly illuminated, just left of center, on his knees. He is a youth in the middle, overwhelmed with veneration for the Almighty Maker. In a transport of gratitude and a posture of profound adoration, he seems to pour out his soul in those emphatic words, "When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him?" And so on. He's positioned in the middle between observational astronomy and philosophy, and he provides the exemplary response of wonder, love, and praise. As I say, he commissioned this picture. There's a 2-page description. In Harvey, then, we see an emblematic imagination or fancy passing over into something more transcendental. Whatever is pleasurable or charming below, he says, let it raise my desire to those sublime delights which are above, which yield not partial, but perfect felicity. Here for a moment, Virgil leads to Beatrice. Earthly loves are caught up in an Augustinian rush of desire. Turning again to Pauline Christology, Harvey continues, "Yes, my soul, let these beauties in miniature," this is in the early section of the book, looking at the beauties of creation, of the terrestrial world, "let these beauties in miniature always remind thee of that glorious person in whom dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily," adding, "let these little emanations teach thee to thirst after the eternal fountain." From the domestic, the miniature, and the picturesque, Harvey rises to contemplate the whole compass of finite perfection and says that it is all only a faint ray shot from that immense source. It is only a drop derived from that inexhaustible ocean of all good. Somehow, Harvey has managed to graft onto his Newtonianism the sort of transcendental language, the transfiguring language, some of the very same metaphors that one finds in the previous century in Platonists like Henry Moore or Ralph Cudworth, and a much earlier age, right back to people like Abbot Suger. In one sense, then, Harvey's project was to develop a new religious aesthetic for his generation of Newtonian readers, to appreciate his response to the natural world that's described by science. Three features of the Newtonian system may be picked out, and then we can look at how he treats them in these meditations. First of all, the vast dimensions of the universe. That's one of the things that this Newtonian picture introduces. Secondly, the nature of void space. And thirdly, the fundamental forces of attraction, especially gravity. As for many others, Harvey was led often from his contemplation of the sheer magnitude of the Newtonian universe to an experience of astonishment, of utter awe. He takes the reader in his contemplation of the starry heavens upward, more and more, farther and farther, soaring beyond the moon, passing through the planets to wing your way, he says, to the highest apparent star. What would that be? I don't know, Sirius? He says, what would you see there? Only other skies expanded and other suns and other star systems in unknown profusion through all the boundless dimensions of space. And what about after this? Keep going, he says. One remains only in the suburbs of creation. Clearly, he has a sense for the infinite. And the infinite is a big deal in the 18th century in calculus and in all sorts of ways. They're fascinated with the infinite. He has a sense for this, the aesthetics of the infinite. And he is aware of the as yet undetectable stellar parallax, that this implies unfathomable distances. And he tries to recreate the sense for the reader in his prose. But then suddenly he turns all this on its head. He pivots, saying that all of this vastness, this prodigious extent of space, is comparatively a mathematical point in God's presence. He's vividly responsive to the mental vertigo produced by contemplating Newtonian space. He says, my very thoughts are lost in the abyss of space. Now, at the same time, for the French thinker Fontenelle, this sort of contemplation led to a profound sense of alienation and insignificance and being alone in the universe. But Harvey provides a different response. He says, how I am overwhelmed with awe and sunk to the lowest prostration of mind. Behold this immense expanse and admire the condescension of your God, that God condescended so much. The response of Harvey and even Fontenelle to the vastness of space in Newtonian cosmology may be compared to the reactions people had in our lifetimes to the famous pale blue dot photograph. Remember this? Taken by the Voyager 1 spacecraft on February 14th, 1990, from a distance of more than 6 billion kilometers, as the probe was leaving the solar system and it turned around to take a picture of us. In this image, the Earth is a mere point of light. Do you see it? It's a crescent only 0.12 pixels in size on Voyager's camera. Carl Sagan famously captured the feelings of a generation when he wrote about this. Look again at that dot, he says. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. For Harvey, the awareness of how vast the universe is led him to an intensified appreciation of how far God condescended to save the human race. It measured the extent to which Christ humbled himself to save us. Space wasn't just vast in the Newtonian system, but secondly, it was also empty. And for Harvey, this pointed to the sheer contingency of material worlds. There's that word again. His favorite metaphor for this was to describe the earth as a pendant, like hanging a picture, pendulous, hanging in Newton's speculative rarefied ether. This is not the old idea of ether, of the quintessence and of a fifth element in Hellenistic philosophy above the moon and so on. But this was speculating about what it is that sort of operates in empty space. He says, what holds up the planetary and stellar orbs in space? Are they hung in golden or adamantine chains? Rest they their enormous load on rocks of marble or columns of brass? No, he says, they are pendulous in fluid ether. So what makes them immovably fixed in their places? He says it's the work of God alone. He hangs the earth and all the ethereal globes upon nothing. He rounded in his palm those dreadfully large globes, which are pendulous in the vault of heaven. He likes that word. And by him they are suspended in fluid ether and cannot be shaken. The metaphysical correlate of empty space was not thus atheism, but the sense that everything is held in existence. It's pendant. It's like it's held by God's hand, a God of love and faithfulness. The repeated refrain of the psalmist that the divine love and faithfulness reach to the skies, it's like it's taken on a vast Newtonian dimension for Harvey when you realize how big the skies are. Thirdly, in dealing with the attractive forces of gravitation and cohesion, Harvey saw both a beautiful simplicity in the design of the universe and, quote, a prodigious ballast which composes the equilibrium and constitutes the stability of things. Attraction is the great chain, he said, which forms the connections of universal nature. And it raised the question he knew everybody was asking. And literally everybody was asking, like, what is gravity? What is it? What is this attraction? Harvey asks, is it a quality in its existence inseparable from matter and in its acting independent of the deity? By this point, it will be no surprise to the reader that he answers quite the reverse. It's the very finger of God, the constant impression of divine power, a principle neither innate in matter, so he rejects the Aristotelian form principle, this is not innate in matter, nor intelligible by mortals. He does not quite equate gravity with the Holy Spirit directly in a vitalist way, but he is willing to say that gravity does bear a considerable analogy to the agency of the Holy Ghost. But in the end, he concludes that even if he could see as far into things as Isaac Newton could, his vision would still be as dim, he says, as what a mole sees, emerging from a hole in the ground. What really mattered was devotion. So he says, quote, having now walked and worshipped in this universal temple, having cast an eye of reason and devotion over it all, having discovered an infinitude of worlds, having met the deity in every view, it remained only to close his meditations with a hymn of praise. And that's what he does. Harvey was hugely successful in cultivating a devotional sensibility. Remember how widely he was read among a large following. One of the many who wrote their imitations of Harvey was the Baptist poet Anne Steele, or Theodosia, as she styled herself in publication. Living in rural Hampshire, this is my next case study, as a single woman with her family, she published her poems on subjects chiefly devotional at 43 years of age in 1760, and her poems and her hymns soon circulated among nonconformists, becoming widely known on both sides of the Atlantic in the 19th century. Her prosperous family were the mainstay of the particular Baptist church in the village in West Hampshire where she lived, and they were, as Cindy Alders says, attempting to negotiate a new world of provincial politeness. The family was literate and literary, and it seemed natural for Anne Steele to compose poems and hymns from a young age. She is often described as the first British hymn writer. Well, she was fond of recording walks in the garden near her family home. and she wrote often about nature. Among her compositions, there is a poem called, this is the title, On Reading Mr. Harvey's Meditations. It not only pays tribute, a homage to Harvey, but also ranging over 4 pages, traces his contemplations, likewise from the tombs to the flower garden in the evening and an evening walk up into the night sky. The poem concludes with the shining lamps of heaven, the stars, advancing in the darkening skies. These stars and planets seem so far away to the naked eye. Like lamps, they sparkle on the unaided sight, but nearer viewed in philosophic light, prodigious orbs, unnumbered worlds arise, new scenes of wonder meet our gazing eyes. It's the findings of the telescope, nearer viewed. It's the findings of the telescope and the reasoning of natural philosophy, philosophic light, she refers to, that have cultivated for Anne Steele a sensibility of wonder in response to the vastness of the universe and the newly appreciated magnitudes of observational astronomy. Her instinctive response is to do what with this? Is to turn it into a personal hymn of praise. Jesus, thy glory beaming from afar, great source of light illumines every star. Thy word informed the planets where to roll and stationed every orb that gilds the pole. To thee, midst all the glories of the skies, to thee alone I raise my longing eyes. The language of informing the planets seems to mean here not only to instruct the planets, inform them, you go here, you go there, but also to animate a deeper forming principle implied by creation, by the word creatio par verbum. In another poem that Anne Steele wrote, An Evening Meditation, she similarly surveys the scene just after sunset, looks over the landscape, and concludes again by looking up at the night sky. The aim of the poem is devotional, it's prayerful. She says her aim is to trace thy forming hand in every scene, and in thy works to meditate thy praise. And so she addresses God as thou, both nature's author and her Lord. In a nice coda, at the end, she encloses these sentiments of praise in the double ascent of the moon and the soul together. In the darkening sky, serenely ascends the silver moon, she says, attended by its train of innumerable stars in the vast expanse of space. But then about 10 lines later, instructed by nature's author and our Lord, in the final tercet, you can see it is the soul that rises to conclude the poem. Led by these, my raptured soul ascends on heaven's heavenly contemplation's soaring wing, to thee, the sacred source of all perfection. It's like as the moon and the stars rise in the night sky, her soul rises with them. Again, this transcendental impulse. Anne Steele, like James Harvey, like Jonathan Edwards, like John and Charles Wesley, responds to the 18th century ideas of nature, above all, with devotional intent and spiritual aspiration. This same devotional attitude that we've been seeing appears in the first published book by an African American, the devout evangelical poet Phyllis Wheatley. Taken forcibly from near Senegal, West Africa, at about 7 years of age and transported to America, the young girl who would be named Phyllis Wheatley was purchased as a slave in August 1761 by the evangelical Boston tailor John Wheatley as a gift for his wife Susanna. Phyllis was one of the millions of enslaved Africans who would arrive in the Americas in the 18th century. Unlike most of those slaves, though, she was given unusual freedoms, opportunities, and education, and treated like a family member in the Wheatley home. Precocious, intellectually gifted, she developed her talents quickly and was soon sufficiently literate to be corresponding with educated clergy and composing classically styled verse. Her writings show an extensive knowledge of the classics, probably in translation, along with an education in geography, history, politics, literature, and as we shall see, astronomy. She was baptized at the Old South Congregational Church in Boston in 1771, where George Whitefield had sometimes preached when in Boston. It's not clear that she ever heard him. However, it is clear that she held him in the highest regard, the most famous preacher of the 18th century, George Whitefield. It was her elegiac poem on the death of that celebrated divine George Whitefield, 1770, that brought her international renown. She was soon drawn into the circle of many influential evangelicals. Her poems on various subjects, religious and moral, 1773, was published when she was scarcely 20, and it was dedicated to the evangelical Countess of Huntingdon. Her writing, her travel, deepened her evangelical connections and introduced her to abolitionist circles. Gaining her freedom in 1774, she issued a strong condemnation of slavery in a letter to Sampson Occam. She was married in 1778, but little is known of her life after that, until her death in 1784. So she's a very significant figure in her own right. Her life stands uniquely at the crossroads of religion, race, gender, literature, as recent scholarship has been keen to explore. It's also clear that she appropriated 18th century literary culture creatively and intelligently and in a remarkable short period of time, and did so in a way that reflected her own concerns. Her work showed, as one critic comments, that culture was and could be the equal possession of all humanity. Jennifer Billingsley argues that Wheatley established a new poetics out of the classical tradition by placing, this is important, an attitude of wonder at the center of her work. But instead of simply being an object of wonder, as an enslaved female poet, that she's kind of like this exotic specimen of wonder, look at what she's doing, she directed people's attention. She directed their wonder to the objects of her own attention. Although most of her verse was modeled on the classics, these objects of her attention included the natural world and subjects of scientific concern. She referred to Isaac Newton as creation's boast and one of the favorites of the skies. In a poem of blank verse directed to those privileged enough to study at Harvard, Cambridge, New England, she exhorted them, "Ye sons of science," to unite the concerns of scientific inquiry with those of devotion. She's exhorting the Harvard students. As they were given opportunity to, quote, scan the heights above, to traverse the ethereal space, and mark the systems of revolving worlds, she reminded them still more to contemplate Christ crucified for a fallen human race. He deigned to die that they might rise again and share with him the sublimest skies. Without self-pity, she marked well the injustice of her situation, excluded from university education, but then assumed the role of teacher to the students and offered a devotion that took astronomy, scanned the heights, up into a more transcendental vision, sublimest skies, through devotion. Fascinating. Another poem treats nature very much in the spirit of other evangelicals. It's called Thoughts on the Works of Providence. And it's an ode not just to creation, but to God as the creator. And it stretches out over 131 lines of pentameter. She begins seeking light divine, a kind of muse, to adequately praise the God of earth and sky, as round its center moves the rolling year. She develops the imagery of rolling or revolving from the point of view of observational astronomy. First, the earth, like a vast machine, revolves around the sun. But then also, from our point of view, the celestial sphere of fixed stars rotates or whirls on the celestial axis every 24 hours. She says, "Adored, forever be the God unseen, which round the sun revolves this vast machine. Though to his eye its mass a point appears, adored the God that whirls surrounding spheres." Again, that same idea like in James Harvey, that it's like a point in God's sight. The word adored in this poem comes around again. It revolves, just as the earth comes round the sun and the celestial sphere around the earth. She recognizes, like Harvey, that all this immense machinery is a mere point in God's perspective and that the agency is divine. As she continues, she speaks of the sun ruling the sky, as in Psalm 19, But now she gives her first indication of incorporating new scientific detail as she describes the astronomical unit, the Earth-Sun distance, in terms quite accurate for her day, saying, "Of miles twice 40 millions is his height, and yet his radiance dazzles mortal sight." What's the distance from the Earth to the Sun? Anybody? Right. So it depends on the aphelion or the perihelion where you measure it from, right? In terms of modern measurements. So in the 18th century, the distance given by scientists is 86 million miles. About 86,051,398 miles. And it was precisely the importance of this measurement that had scientists traveling the globe, the first international scientific project to send scientists all over the world to measure the transit of Venus during Wheatley's lifetime. She got the calculation right in terms of the science of her day. Incidentally, the much more privileged, much more educated Augustus Toplady, he's the author of the hymn Rock of Ages, Calvinist in England, got it wrong about the same time, adding a 0 to the millions decimal place more than once, which meant he was only, wait for it, 774 million miles off. But she got it right. But again, her instinct is to respond with devotional sensibility to the scientific calculation of the Earth-Sun distance, astonished that at such a distance still the sun warms the earth and imparts vigor to all that grows, that the earth remains true to her course. She exclaims, "Almighty, in these wondrous works of thine, what power, what wisdom, and what goodness shine. And are thy wonders, Lord, by men explored, and yet creating glory unadored." The real wonder for her is that these things might not lead scientists to astonished adoration of their Creator. It was, finally, not all about reason in the age of reason. Love answers to eternal love and invites wonder, emphasized by the enjambment in the opening couplet of the final stanza, with the word appears, followed by the caesura. Infinite love where'er we turn our eyes appears. This every creature's wants supplies. As for Julian of Norwich earlier, it was love for Wheatley that was most fundamental to the universe. All that remained, she said, was for man to shake off his ingratitude and swell the chorus of eternal praise. Phyllis Wheatley demonstrates what a dynamic force evangelical devotion could be in relation to culture and science, how readily this could be taken up and appropriated far, far from the center of metropolitan power and privilege. To sum up, finally, we have surveyed the response of several evangelicals in the 18th century to the new science, leading figures such as the Wesley brothers and Jonathan Edwards, as well as these lesser-known figures, James Harvey, Anne Steele, and Phyllis Wheatley. There are many others we could look at, that would be fun to look at, such as the practicing scientist Isaac Milner at Cambridge, who held the Lucasian chair, Isaac Newton's old chair at Cambridge, or the artist and amateur astronomer John Russell in London. This is actually his pastel of the moon. He used to study the moon with his Doland reflector telescope in his backyard in London, 6 hours a night for 2 decades, taking measurements with his micrometer of all the details of the moon, and he produced this vast monumental pastel of the moon. It hangs at the Museum of the History of Science in Oxford. There are many more figures we could look at, but I focused tonight on these literary figures in the hope of capturing something of the religious sensibility that went along with the new science for evangelicals. There was a sustained concern to perceive God's immediate presence in the natural world and respond with loving devotion. Along with the new physics had come a tectonic shift in metaphysics with enormous spiritual implications. There was now literally nothing inside matter, no apparent spirituality to the observable universe. Natural objects had been spiritually scoured. This was Newton's vis inertia principle. Prior to the advent of materialist science, the dominant outlook was instead to view nature as having, in Aristotle's terms, within itself a principle of motion. There were intelligible forms. The shift away from this was spiritually troubling enough for Ralph Cudworth to write nearly 1,000 pages from his college study in late 17th century Cambridge, trying to expose the atheism implied by modern natural philosophy. The word dead came up often in his description of the world described by the new science. It was, he said, a world of dead and stupid matter, a dead cadaverous thing. Cadaverous, a great word. A dead and wooden world, and so on. The evangelicals came on the scene after the initial ferment over all this had largely subsided, after a whole generation of religious thinkers had debated how best to respond to the Newtonian system. If they paused to look around, they might have observed, it looks like we're all Newtonian now. So how would the devotional instinct to look upon nothing as separate from God be maintained? Ratiocination and arguments from design were well and good, but there had to be a more direct experience of God in nature, an immediate consciousness of the presence of God. This is what we have seen witness to in our case studies. The devout response to Newtonian science was evident not only in the writings of John and Charles Wesley and Jonathan Edwards, but a chorus of other voices that take us to the end of the century when the natural sciences were becoming more defined. So whether it's poets, painters, medics, chemists, theologians, philosophers, evangelicals in their various ways continue to offer up the praise of the mute creation, seen now through a Newtonian lens, or as Harvey said, through an evangelical telescope. Thank you.
Well, we now have the opportunity to interact with Bruce Hindmarsh over his superb lecture on how evangelicals responded to the rise of science. We'll begin with a short response before we open the floor to questions for 20 minutes, so you can be formulating your questions now. And again, we plan to end at around 9:10. Let me turn now to introduce tonight's respondent. Amanda Russell-Jones is a sessional lecturer in history and interdisciplinary studies here at Regent. Amanda holds a PhD in history from the University of Birmingham, which is focused on the life and work of Josephine Butler. Here at Regent, she teaches on several courses, including Women, Church and State, as well as Technology, Wilderness and Creation, which she teaches from a sailboat around the Gulf Islands. Welcome, Amanda.
Good evening. I should perhaps say as respondent right at the beginning that I am the recipient of a dubious award for science. At the age of 14, I was given a school science prize for my performance in physics, chemistry and biology in the end of year exams. It was dubious, not because I'd cheated, but because the chemistry department made the mistake of setting exactly the same exam they'd set 3 years previously. And my revision partner had a sister who was 3 years older and went on to medical school. So we had the corrected answers in front of us. We confessed, but the school decided to still give me the prize. My father, however, who was a scientist, said, "You're not a scientist, you're a semi-scientist." He was always very encouraging about what I did, but he was right. And it was only years later that I reflected upon the fact that I came out of the bookstore with him, having spent the prize, holding a copy of The History of Science in my hand. I think he probably had more idea of where I was headed in terms of history and the Queen of Sciences rather than anything to do with test tubes. But thank you, David and Bruce, very much for all the work that's gone into putting this evening together in the very stimulating, fascinating lecture that we've just heard. And I believe this is an important piece of work. Karl Barth once said that people should read with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. But in more recent years, scholars have realized that that was exactly what people were doing and have always done and are still doing today. They were reading and applying the Bible in the light of what was going on in their contemporary culture. They were bringing questions to the text raised by the perception of how their culture was changing their beliefs, challenging their beliefs. Their theology was a contextual theology. And Bruce's work has given us windows into the 18th century Christian mind as men and women grappled with and reflected on the discoveries of Newtonian science. and how it made them see the world in a new way, indeed made them see God in a new light. Through your thorough knowledge of the period and your extensive research on this topic on both sides of the Atlantic, you've made the case that the early evangelical communities in the transatlantic awakening were an important local context for negotiating the meaning and application of natural knowledge in the 18th century. As you told us, the new science literally landed on Jonathan Edwards' desk in the library and demanded study and response. But you've also shown us very clearly how the response of early evangelicals was one of doxology, as they looked through the evangelical telescope and the evangelical microscope. The work of God in creation and the work of God in redemption, as you say, aroused the same religious emotions and the same response of doxology, which the characters you have highlighted tonight expressed eloquently in prose, poetry, hymns, and so on. I was also pleased to find women in a lecture on the history of science and theology, since it was not until 1945 that the Royal Academy of the Sciences changed its rules so that a woman could become a fellow, which was actually the same year that a woman could first study theology in Oxford. I want to focus, because I was invited to bring my own particular interests into this conversation on the interface between theology and science. I want to focus on women, the Bible, slavery, and women's biblical interpretation. So there are two parts of your lecture that I want to consider, which will become two questions that you may like to comment on before others bring their thoughts and questions. So I want to comment on Phyllis Wheatley and Wesley's tradesmen. As far as Wesley's tradesmen are concerned, I question whether 9/10 of people had the literacy or the money to appropriate physico-theological doxology through Wesley's book. But rather than the negatives, could you say more about how these ideas were transmitted to the average weaver in the pew or to the man or woman who was working on the land? I'm intrigued by the electricity machine, and I was also intrigued by the children's books. But turning to Phyllis Wheatley, who's one of my heroes, you draw attention to Wheatley's importance as, you say, her life stands uniquely at the crossroads of religion, race, gender, and literature. And you make clear that she appropriated 18th century literary culture creatively and intelligently in a way that very much reflected her own concerns. I want to argue that the importance of Wheatley's expression of the Creator God and her response of wonder, love, and praise is even more significant than you claim, and maybe the most profound example of physico-theological doxology we've come across tonight. She holds the extraordinary place in American literary tradition of being the first published African-American and the first published African-American woman, and she was and is an inspiration for those who followed. Not least because she had been interviewed by a panel of 18 men to verify that she wrote the poetry herself, since, as Bruce alluded, there was a long-standing skepticism as to whether the African could ever create formal literature or master arts and sciences. Our focus is primarily transatlantic spiritual awakening and science, but I want to turn up the volume on another element of this transatlantic world that evangelicalism was developing in: ongoing transatlantic slavery. So my comment is on transatlantic slavery and its relation to theology and science, and ultimately to Wheatley's writing. For part of the argument as to whether slavery was biblical hinged on whether the non-white person, the African or the savage, was human or had a separate origin to Adam. Polygenesis was more firmly on the agenda at the end of the 18th century and in the 19th than in the period you are considering. Nevertheless, the ideas had been around since Voltaire. And you mentioned Whitefield, and you discussed Whitefield and slavery in your book, and I appreciate that time tonight did not permit us so much here. But Edwards and Whitefield were slave owners who did not free their slaves upon their deaths. Indeed, the scholar Eugene Genovese makes the point that Whitefield was a hero to the planters, since he argued for the introduction of slave owning in the state of Georgia, where it did not at that time exist. And although he warned slave owners that they needed to treat their slaves better than they were doing, he was nevertheless seduced, we might say, as were others, by the notion of the godly slave owner and the good that could result for the extension of God's kingdom through the labor and the profits of slavery. And Bruce, as you make clear in your book, and in your lecture, Wheatley comes to the attention of the public through her elegy written on Whitefield's death. And commentators have pointed out that she extols Whitefield as a servant of God and evangelist, and makes only a small reference to slavery. So Wheatley says of Whitefield, "Thou didst, in strains of eloquence refined, inflame the soul and captivate the mind." And Wheatley quotes Whitefield as saying various things, one of them being Whitefield's saying of Christ, "Take him, ye Africans, he longs for you. Impartial Saviour is his title due. If you will choose to walk in grace's road, you shall be sons and kings and priests to God." Some have seen this as Wheatley exhorting those of African heritage to accept Whitefield's Saviour, which I'm sure she was. But I think there is more to it. When Whitefield spoke of the impartial Saviour, presumably he was forensically applying the work of Christ to the salvation of the slave as much as to the free person. But as a slave owner, he was not saying slave and free were equal in every other respect in God's eyes. But I believe the impartiality of God meant more than that to Wheatley. Is she, in common with other enslaved African Americans, hearing the word of God, but hearing it in a different way, drawing a distinction between the God of the Bible and the God of the white person, the Church of God and the Church of America? I would argue that her knowledge of the Bible and her careful, observational, doxological study of God's second book, the Book of Nature, led her to the assurance that God was impartial. Full stop, period. The witness of the Spirit within confirmed her confidence that the God of all creation was her God. She wrote that in bringing her from Africa, God had brought her out of Egyptian darkness, but that now she faced modern Egyptians in the promised land. And I think she's conjuring a countercultural theology. Harvey's theological statement of faith is magnificent, and one longs to see it appreciated in contemporary church life. Including his summary, we should always view the visible system with an evangelical telescope and with an evangelical microscope. So my question, what then accounts for the 18th century evangelical blind spot on racial equality? The long hours, night after night, systematically paying attention to the moon and the stars. The rapt, minute observations of drops of dew and spiders' webs. And yet the complete inability to look at a black face and see it, or rather him or her, as a mirror of oneself and a co-equal image of God. You say that these evangelicals, quote, nested the insights of materialist science within a larger vision of the universe in which God was emphatically present. I believe that Wheatley did that. And you say that their devotion did a kind of metaphysical work above its pay grade. And I believe that Wheatley's devotion to God did indeed do a metaphysical work above its pay grade. Her devotion to the God of the Newtonian science that she so carefully referred to. She too saw the human person renewed by God's Spirit could be conscious of God's presence everywhere in the material world. But in her case, everywhere, including in the full humanity of black as well as white. This evening, our primary concern has been Newtonian science and its influence on worldview, including the theology of evangelicals in the transatlantic awakening. But slavery and the fundamental question of the humanity of the African is part of that cultural context. A second major debate at the interface of theology and science is at play at this time and in this transatlantic space. Maybe it is in Phyllis's genuine thanksgiving to God for the life and work of Whitefield, which led to her being the first published African American, that we see the mystery of the grace of God. Maybe, just maybe, it is Phyllis, named after the ship that transported her into slavery, who has the most significant physico-theological doxology, lost in wonder, love, and praise to the God of all creation, in whose image, as a female, black, enslaved poet, she knew herself to be.
Thank you, Amanda. Really tremendous. Just a couple comments in response. In terms of, Wesley's sort of tradesmen and so on, I think there has been quite a lot of work done on literacy among the Methodists, and it really is amazing. So Vicky Toller-Burton's book on spiritual literacy and about reading among Methodists and so on, there really is an entire educational program that is pushing out literacy, and it's a tremendous site in terms of education, literacy, spiritual literacy, and then people also then, as Vicky Toller-Burton points out, people then being able to speak for themselves, not just to read for themselves. So maybe it wasn't 9/10, maybe Wesley exaggerated, but maybe 7/10 of people could read his work. I don't know, but I think, he also said, or somebody said that it was the most unique work of its kind, the most compendious work of its kind, and I think it probably was true. There was no other anthology like this. And Wesley was brilliant at being able to speak, as he said, in plain words to plain people. So it'd be interesting to see if we could find witnesses from ordinary people and that were actually reading the book. I'm not aware of those. And then in terms of Phyllis Wheatley, I thank you for how you've drawn all that out. I think a couple things. I'm very happy to yield to her the place of most significant in terms of, for the reasons you've said. Mostly what I wanted to do, in a sense, is just take her seriously and pay tribute to her ideas and just listen to her ideas on the specific point of Newtonian science. But I think you bring up a really important point that in the age of reason, there was a kind of inability to see what seemed to be unreason. There was this black spot on the age of reason that's race, And I think even something about the Newtonian world in which truths and spaces are all interchangeable and all the same, and that things are everywhere the same and replaceable, and an appreciation, I think that as you put it, for things to be everywhere included, it would include the full humanity of both black and white. So Peter Choi, many others have written about sort of Whitefield on slavery and about some of these issues. That wasn't so much my focus tonight, but I think you're absolutely right, is in terms of the appropriation and the agency of Phyllis Wheatley, like David George among the Acadians and the black diaspora that were loyalists that were transported to Nova Scotia and then that were transported to Sierra Leone. And as they marched ashore in Sierra Leone, what did they sing? They sang the song of Miriam, the song of Exodus. It was Exodus narratives that they were, of liberation, that they were appropriating. And so I think it's really important to pay attention to the ways in which that kind of language is being appropriated. So we have examples, as we would say, good and bad examples of sort of evangelicals responding to issues of race and issues of slavery and so on. Some that can see earlier and some later the egalitarian implications of the gospel. And I wrote a book about John Newton, and for most of his life, the author of Amazing Grace, he was blind to these issues of race, slavery, chattel slavery, and it's only late in his life when he came to see it that he did what he could, that he joined in the efforts for abolition, that he wrote against the slave trade and so on. But the dawning of that consciousness for many came quite late. It's a little bit like how people responded to the Bloody Code, the capital legislations of the 18th century. Initially, there's that kind of spiritual language of egalitarianism and that spiritual solidarity with the prisoner that, in a sense, that's the foundation later for John Howard and prison reform. But I think often people can't initially see that, and for some it comes much later. So, thank you.
So we now have 15 minutes for further questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please proceed up to one of the microphones at the back row of seats. And if you're with us on Facebook Live via our live stream, feel free to submit a question in the comment section there. Over to you, sir.
Bruce, wonderful lecture. Thank you so much. In the year 3750, in a post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear Holocaust world, in the charred remains of the Bodleian Library, a book of Phyllis Wheatley's writings was found. In the year 3750, what did the text, form and source critics make of the possibility that a 31-year-old woman could have written this, who was formerly a slave?
A thought experiment. 3750, you discover this like you'd never known it before. I think there'd be a sense of wonder, a sense of what would people say in the year 3750. I think surely there'd be a sense of delight that that somehow her work found the light of day. First book by an African American writer that finally such a thing appeared. I don't know what to say beyond that, but I like the thought experiment. I used to do that with my students. Imagine that a bomb went off and no book was left but this one. What would you make of it? Yeah.
So thank you very much, Bruce, for a wonderful lecture. I keep thinking about how do we apply these principles to our days now, and sometimes I guess I'm old enough to feel a bit of humility around how we look back on people, and not that the things that they did, like owning slaves, were good, but when I look around me in the work that I do, and we're friends, and some of those things, that why is it that there always seems to be in an age where in whatever age we're in, that we don't see in that glass the humanity of the other. And in our age now, I think the race issue and the foreigner, that continues, but also the very young people with disabilities, people at the end of life, are seen as lives that are not worth living. And so how do we, it strikes me that some of the ways that this was addressed in the age that you're talking about was through the arts. And that was how they got to people. So what lessons, having really kind of stewed about this, what lessons do you think there are for us today to take this out to a wider world?
Thank you. That's a great question. It is haunting to think of what are those things in my culture that are written in letters too large to read? What are those things where I am captive? There's a kind of captivity to some of those ideas. What can we do to be aware of that? And how can we operate with a kind of humility? What are we missing? I think, and you mentioned some examples of that. One of the things that came to mind, Margaret, there was a paper I wrote a few years ago on spiritual formation interacting with social scientists. And one of the things that I tried to draw upon, I'm thinking of the spirit of wonder and how that can be operationalized in a sense, both in terms of humility and a kind of chasteness in what we know and a kind of epistemological reserve, but also how that can lead us to treat other people. So if there's that sense that the language that can be used about when speaking about God, we can talk about apophasis. There's a point where we run out of words. There's more to God than we can take in. And so whether people call that negative theology or apophatic theology, we reach a point not of emptiness, but we can't take in anymore. And if creatures made in God's image bear anything of the image of their creator, I think the same is true of creation, that wonder, being suspended in wonder in the face of all that is created, and especially the analogia personalitatis, the analogy of persons, that this is a person made in God's image, means there's always more here than I can take in, and I treat other people with a sense of wonder and a sense of awe and a sense of humility. And I think it has real practical implications. Wonder is not just being lost in a reverie somewhere, but it actually means that we stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene. We stand amazed in the presence of all that God has made. And we therefore treat it with a kind of love and reverence and attention. Love wants to explore every detail of the beloved. Love stands in awe of the beloved. And all of these things, I think, invite a certain kind of response to people and to the world God's made.
For our next question, let's go to the live stream and see if we have something there.
Thank you, Dr. Heimersch. This question comes from Trinity Western University, where students are gathered together watching through live stream. The question reads, do you see any exemplars of Christian leaders, pastors, artists, etc., reflecting on the discoveries of modern science, for example, relativity, quantum physics? What might hold them back? What could open the door for more?
Exemplars of modern Christian leaders and others reflecting on modern science. I went to the lecture by Collins, the geneticist here at UBC, on the human genome. I think he was somebody who his response and him talking about his faith was deeply winsome. Francis Collins giving an account of the way in which his, I think it was precisely, and he used the language of finding it deeply satisfying, the relationship of his faith to his science. That was one of the examples that comes to mind. I'm trying to think of the cosmologist who wrote that little essay, What Do the Heavens Declare? I think there are many examples, I just can't think of them right now, today as well as in the past. But as a historian, I would usually say, not my period, So, yeah.
Thanks for all the good stuff. I was just wondering about, thinking of the Methodists in particular, but not necessarily uniquely to them, about all the darkness, the cruelty from the industrial machine, the cosmic machine, people being drowned in storms and infants dying. How did they relate all of that, providence and so on, to this new order that they were observing? Like, how did they incorporate it into their faith, I suppose, as well? I'm having difficulty formulating what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, actually.
In the advance of, industrialization and the developments in modernization in the 18th century, there were people who were very much left behind. There's the gin crisis in the 1720s that led many people into addiction, and they would sell their tools and so on. There was the enlargement of parishes outside of places like Bristol with early industrialization that left people without any kind of social systems and so on. And one of the, I think, astonishing things is the way in which Wesley in particular, his mission was to every one of those people. It was to the outsider. Anybody who was outside, anybody who felt too dirty to come to communion in the church. They talked about seeing the gutters, the tears flowing down the faces of the coal miners as they would hear some of the preaching. And Wesley was happy to meet at 5 a.m. with 10 people, working class people in a parish, and then move on. And he set up the first micro-enterprise loans in England to help some of those people who were lost in addiction and suffering in London to regain their tools and to be able to go back to work and then pay back the micro-enterprise loan to give to somebody else. He established the first free medical dispensaries in England. They gathered, the Methodist class meetings began by gathering a penny a week from people to be able to give to some of those without the social supports and so on. So I think, this is a really important movement that had, this is not the great reversal where evangelicals just left behind any kind of social concern. This was born in the midst of social concerns for the outsider. Wesley's very last sermon that he gave, when he spoke, where his voice was cracking as a 90-year-old man, or somewhere around 90 years of age, was about the wedding feast. And it was about his appeal to the outsider. And the last thing he said is, "Still there is room." And his voice broke. Still there is room. So I think there is a very deep concern for those that have been left behind by whatever kind of advances were going on in society.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Over here.
I'm very glad to hear that the Trinity Western students are still out there, very active. I spent 31 years there. I found your talk very, very interesting, and I also liked the response of the respondent. Sorry I didn't get your name.
Amanda.
It's a very interesting exchange. What I want to talk about is more how does the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, get into the masses, because many of them are, of course, illiterate, but and one way they do, of course, like in England, my field is more Central Europe, but in England, there's a fantastic plow. It's not been invented, the Moldborg plow. It was developed in the 8th century already, but it was an incredibly efficient plow that helped you cultivate lands that were otherwise very marshy and not wet and not dry enough to cultivate. So in that way, even the illiterate masses would find out what science was accomplishing for them, especially in technology. I have a couple of instances that I'd like to share from Central Europe, where the masses are again being affected. Joseph II, the Austrian emperor, who they called an enlightened monarch, introduced what we would call today green burials. He thought the poor people were wasting way too much on very expensive funerals, and also worthy fertilizer. So he simply passed a law. He didn't have a parliament or a Supreme Court to bother him, so he simply passed a law that from now on all bodies would be wrapped in a burlap bag, put underground again, 6 or 8 feet, whatever they are, and then they'd throw.
I wonder, sir, if you could maybe summarize a little and pose a question, just for the sake of time, because we have a
sure,
couple
good, thank you. I'll just stop right there.
In terms of how the scientific revolution reached the masses, I think this is, it's a fascinating period in terms of the culture, the explosion of the periodical press. So in terms of magazines and newspapers and so on, there's a lot that's being published. There are popular science demonstrations, especially with electricity, all the tricks you can do with electricity for people. But it's also a part of everyday life for people, things like navigation. This was the century of the hunt for the accurate way of calculating longitude at sea, which had enormous implications in the age of the merchant marine for whether ships crash or not. whether they found her or not. And all the efforts, so this is Isaac Milner we didn't talk about. He was a part of the longitude story in the 18th century, calculating and all the new ways of calculating until a chronometer could be made that could be taken to sea, it would be accurate, Greenwich Mean Time, and so on, to keep track of all that. And so in a maritime society, they are aware, a lot of people are aware of different developments in science, but it's local, it's contextual, it's practical, and it's sort of building up in a sense. Sometimes it was actually the French philosophers who came up with the idea that there was a Lockean, Newtonian synthesis that just took over society, just simply took over society, and it was basically secularizing. That's not what happened. It wasn't that simple. Yeah.
Great. We have time for 2 final questions. We'll start with Ross here.
Bruce, thank you for an outstanding lecture. It's interesting to think about the 20th century and what went wrong with evangelicals and how they contributed to the conflict model, but maybe we won't go there tonight. I had a question really about the Spirit. You talked about Harvey invoking the Spirit as accounting for gravity. I wondered if you could comment on, so one tends to see in people such as you've been commenting on the Christology, which is lovely to see, the Christology involved in creation. Is there a profound pneumatology around providence, for example, in Edwards and Wesley?
I would direct people to a fine book by Ross Hastings on Jonathan Edwards, which talks about his pneumatology, and in all seriousness, I would. And I think Edwards does that kind of work in many ways, doesn't he? In terms of Edwards is fascinating. He develops I forget who it is who calls it the funky factor in Edwards, but he develops a kind of philosophical idealism, and there's ways I think his whole program developed, and he understands God's agency, God's spiritual agency in the world, actively every moment in the world. And it actually begins, I found this argument 5 times in his science notebooks, by reflecting on what I think is Newton's Query 32 in the Opticks on solidity and cohesion. And Edwards reflects on what is it that makes something solid, massy, hard particle, and makes it solid and indivisible. And he says it's not so much that it's a substance that's hard as it's a force that is resistance. One part of space resists another part of space. And then he inserts, Ross knows all this is occasionalism, that what happens when we consistently see something solid or we see something consistently happening like a law in nature is God is every moment doing it. And that's his occasionalism. God is intervening at every moment and acting so consistently that we call it a law. And in this kind of way, and I don't know is that directly sort of Trinitarian, the Spirit, you would know better than me, but he sees God's Spirit active in the world every moment. I'm not sure. I think most of the other figures I'm looking at, I think it is Christology. It's more Colossians that they go to. But.
And our final question here.
Thank you for your lecture, Bruce. A little while ago I was reading and came across a letter that John Wesley wrote very near his death, I believe it was within a year of his death, encouraging William Wilberforce in his work of abolition. And that was interesting to me, listening to Amanda's, with Whitefield and Wesley being exact, their lives overlapping constantly and their ministries very similar. But I'm curious if the difference between their positions on slavery has anything to do, or if it has anything to do with Wesley's embrace of sort of a changing scientific paradigm. If you've come across any link there, or what you account for that difference between Wesley and Whitefield on that issue.
That's a very good question. I'm not sure. Whitefield would never be accused of overthinking a problem, and Whitefield basically didn't engage with science very much at all, and a lot of it was practical exigencies in Georgia and so on, and how he wanted to run the orphanage that was going into debt and so on, and how he sort of backed into slavery in a sense, even though, as Amanda pointed out, he was much loved and his rhetoric and so on appealed to many African Americans and slaves. So I wonder if in part, the Quakers seem to be having more advanced views in terms of slavery, if you want to call it that, but Wesley is one of those who did too, exactly what his reasoning was, how he got there. It's an interesting case study to contrast Wesley and Whitefield. It may be that one of the things, and this alludes to Ross's comment about popular evangelicalism and episodes in the 20th century and so on, it may be that this movement that arose that has an educated leadership in the 18th century, the relationship between, if you like, elite and popular, educated, and the kind of popular culture, there's always danger in a popular movement that things can kind of go off into sheer populism, and things can become unthoughtful, or things can become reactionary. And I think as a movement, evangelicalism does require, how is this for an advertisement, a place like Regent College, where people can be thoughtful about these things. And I think Wesley was genuinely probably more thoughtful about these things.